One drop of blood. That's all she promised it would take. Over 200 conditions: cancer, HIV, diabetes, heart disease, screened simultaneously in under 4 hours for less than $10 a test. No needle, no lab, no waiting. At your local Walgreens. To put that in perspective, a standard cholesterol panel at a traditional lab ran $50 to $100 out of pocket. A full thyroid panel, over $200. Theranos claimed it could do all of it combined for the price of a coffee. And the world didn't just believe her, it handed her $700 million and a $9 billion valuation. The US military explored deploying her device on active battlefields. Walgreens restructured its entire pharmacy model around her. Forbes named her the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history, worth $4.5 billion at 30 years old. She hadn't inherited it. She hadn't married into it. She had apparently built it from a dorm room idea. At 19, Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984 into a family wired for ambition. Her father held senior roles at Enron and USAID. Her mother staffed congressional committees, and her great-great-grandfather had built a business empire in the 1800s. She arrived at Stanford on a President's Scholarship in 2002, filed her first patent application at 19, and dropped out before her sophomore year ended. What drove her was a specific, almost clinical fear of needles, trypanophobia, which affects roughly 25% of adults worldwide. But where most people simply look away during a blood draw, she looked at the $70 billion blood testing industry and saw a system nobody had bothered to fix. Quest Diagnostics and LabCorp together controlled over 50% of all US testing, operating on a model unchanged since the 1970s. Bulk needle draws, centralized labs, days-long turnaround, opaque pricing. A 2014 study estimated that nearly 50,000 Americans died annually from conditions that routine early screening could have caught. Conditions they never screened for because of cost, inconvenience, or a simple fear of needles. She refunded her $3,000 Stanford fellowship and used it to incorporate Theranos. She constructed her persona with the same precision she claimed to bring to her science. The black turtleneck was a conscious Steve Jobs reference. She trained her natural voice lower, cultivating a baritone authority that made boardrooms of much older men instinctively defer. She understood that in Silicon Valley, the founder is the product. And her product, young, female, visionary, world-saving, was irresistible. Between 2004 and 2014, Holmes raised $700 million, and her investor list was unlike anything Silicon Valley had seen before. Not venture capitalists, old money, establishment power. Rupert Murdoch wrote a personal check for $125 million, the largest investment of his career outside his own media properties. The DeVos family put in $100 million. Cox Enterprises, $100 million. Carlos Slim, then the wealthiest man on earth, was involved. And crucially, none of them received audited financials, independent scientific validation, or a working product demonstration. Holmes cited competitive secrecy. Astonishingly, they agreed. Her board was perhaps the most decorated in Silicon Valley history. Holmes had assembled a board that could open every door in Washington while asking almost no technical questions. At its $9 billion peak, Theranos was worth more than Twitter at its IPO. Holmes appeared on the covers of Time, Fortune, and Forbes in the same year. The New Yorker called her the next Steve Jobs. She testified before Congress, spoke at the Clinton Global Initiative, and collected honorary degrees. She was, by every public metric, one of the most important entrepreneurs alive. By 2013, Theranos had wellness centers inside 40 Walgreens locations across Arizona and California. iPad check-ins, calm lighting, a 30-second finger prick, results within hours. For uninsured and underinsured patients especially, it genuinely felt like a revolution. People lined up. They trusted it with their bodies and their medical decisions. What they didn't know was that the Edison device named after Holmes's personal hero could reliably run only a handful of the 200-plus tests Theranos advertised. For everything else, they used standard commercial lab analyzers, diluting the finger prick samples to fit machines designed for full draws. That dilution silently corrupted the results. Internal quality control logs showed error. Within 48 hours, Theranos' secondary market valuation had dropped 25%. Federal regulators announced an inspection within 72. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services spent months inside Theranos' Newark, California laboratory, documenting unvalidated equipment, falsified proficiency testing, and a culture in which staff were actively pressured to make numbers work rather than report what machines actually produced. In July 2016, CMS revoked Theranos' laboratory certification and personally banned Holmes from owning or operating any U.S. clinical lab for a minimum of 2 years. In 27 years of that particular federal sanction, it had been applied fewer than a handful of times. Walgreens terminated its partnership immediately and shuttered all 40 wellness center locations. Safeway wrote off $350 million. The FDA issued a formal warning on the nanotainer blood collection device. Every partner disappeared. Holmes gave one last television interview composed, defiant, promising a next-generation device called the Mini Lab, speaking about the future with the same unblinking conviction she had always projected. Nobody was listening anymore. The DOJ had been building its criminal case since 2016. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on 12 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy, covering 2 categories of victims: investors defrauded of hundreds of millions and patients who had received medically unreliable results without their knowledge. The trial began August 31st, 2021. It ran 15 weeks. The prosecution called 29 witnesses, exhibits numbered in the thousands. Holmes arrived each morning in muted conservative clothing, navy, gray, beige, with her infant son visible in the public gallery. Even here, the performance hadn't stopped. It had simply changed stages. Her defense rested on 3 pillars: that she had genuinely believed in the technology, that Balwani had controlled day-to-day operations and concealed critical failures from her, and that Balwani had subjected her to sustained psychological abuse that impaired her judgment. The prosecution dismantled this with paper. Emails showed Holmes had been directly informed of specific test inaccuracies and had replied asking how to manage investor communication, not how to fix the problem. Investor reports carried the logos of Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline without their knowledge or consent. One Pfizer executive testified that seeing his company's name on a Theranos document made him physically uncomfortable. 11 patients testified. One described a 10 p.m. emergency call from her doctor after Theranos flagged her potassium levels as critically dangerous, levels that turned out to be completely normal. January 3rd, 2022, guilty on 4 counts of investor fraud. November 18th, 2022, sentenced to 11 years and 3 months with $452 million in restitution order. She reported to FPC Bryan, a federal prison camp in Texas, on May 30th, 2023. Theranos is gone. Holmes is in prison. Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts and sentenced to nearly 13 years, harsher than Holmes. Murdoch alone wrote off $125 million. The total investor losses exceeded $900 million. But the most important question the Theranos story raises isn't about Elizabeth Holmes. It's about the ecosystem that let her run for over a decade. She raised $700 million without ever providing audited financials or an independent scientific validation. In pharmaceuticals, aerospace, or finance, this would have been legally impossible. In Silicon Valley's fake it till you make it culture, where skepticism was reframed as a failure of vision, it was standard. The FDA's laboratory-developed test loophole allowed companies to self-certify diagnostic accuracy without pre-market approval. Theranos exploited it for years. That loophole has since been closed, partly as a direct result of this case. Holmes had engineered not just a company, but a shield aboard so prestigious, a brand so emotionally compelling, a legal team so aggressive, and an internal culture so sealed that the normal mechanisms of accountability couldn't reach her. She understood that in Silicon Valley, the story of saving the world is almost impossible to question without looking like the villain. The people who paid the steepest price never appeared at a gala or sat on a board. The patient who got a false cancer scare. The man who delayed a cardiology referral because his Theranos numbers looked fine. the woman who made a reproductive decision based on a miscarriage result that was wrong. They were the people the whole enterprise claimed to be saving. They are the ones still living with what it did. Holmes will be eligible for release in 2032. She'll be 48. People who've spoken to her since sentencing say she remains largely unreflective, still describing Theranos with a kind of mournful distance, as though it were a company that simply ran out of time, rather than a fraud she engineered. The question her story leaves permanently open is this: where exactly is the line between a founder who believes so completely that they outrun the evidence, and someone who knew at each specific decision point and chose the story over the truth? Because those decision points are in the court record. The emails exist. The moments where she knew and chose anyway, they are documented. Maybe the most frightening thing about Elizabeth Holmes is not that she was a monster. It's that she was entirely, recognizably human, and that the system didn't just fail to stop her. It handed her a microphone, a magazine cover, and $700 million, and told her to keep going. One drop of blood. That was the promise that built a $9 billion empire and fooled a 4-star general, a former Secretary of State, and the most powerful media mogul on Earth. And one drop of truth, patient, persistent, and unstoppable to bring every last bit of it down. Holmes is not a one-off. She's a chapter in a much longer book full of founders who bent reality, investors who stopped asking questions, and systems that rewarded the performance of success over its substance. On the Billionaire's Playbook, we go inside those chapters. The strategies, the blind spots, and the exact moments ambition crossed the line. You watch this to the end. This channel is for you. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Who do you want us to cover next? Share this with one person who needs to see it.